In ancient times, in the time of inspiration, the poet flew from one world to another, riding on dragons, as the Chinese said. Isaiah rode on those dragons, so did Lipo and Pindar. They dragged behind them long tails of dragon smoke. Well, that is my way of welcoming each of you to Dale Byron's Poetry Podcast. However, I've got news. We are changing the name and the focus of the podcast. It will still include amazing, incredible poetry, but each podcast we're going to focus on one main poet, as we are today, as we focus on Robert Bly and what I'm calling his dangerous dragon smoke. Now look, as I say, we're still going to focus on amazing poetry, but the new name of the podcast is Why Our Souls Don't Dither. Why Our Souls Don't Dither. Poetry, songs, and other tricks for eco-citizens. You see, I have in my own life begun to imagine that the most pressing thing in our lives, the most pressing and even crushing issue in our lives, is the ecological challenges, conundrums that we are all facing. And I believe that poetry is an amazing tool to be able to work with this. I believe that in addition to poetry's critical work of healing, nurturing, and inspiring us, a main job of art in general, and poetry in particular, is to shift and surprise us out of our habitual, often hide-bound ways of thinking. Have you noticed? And when it comes to ecology, which is the study of how things actually fit together and work together, we need every awareness-building trick poetry has up its sleeve. Now, given this new name and focus of the podcast, I thought, it's no mistake that I decided to choose Robert Bly, who is a poet of amazing talent, who we just lost to this plane last year. And he's such an amazing poet in his own right, and his translations are so skillful and so artful. And he has this amazing way of being able to pull the rug right out from under our normal way of seeing things, to be able to surprise us in the most tantalizing ways, and to be able to have our vision and our assumptions changed and challenged. And so that's why I chose to begin this new focus with Robert Bly. Now, going forward, I read from his essay called Looking for Dragon Smoke, which is, of course, where the title of this podcast comes from. And I want to continue on with a few more sentences from the beginning of this essay. He says, Robert Bly says, This dragon smoke means that a leap has taken place in the poem. In other words, when the metaphor of the dragon smoke means that some kind of leap has taken place, and he's going to describe it here. He says, in many ancient works of art, we notice a long floating leap at the center of the work. That leap can be described as a leap from the conscious to the latent intelligence and back again, a leap from the known part of the mind to the unknown part and back to the known. Again, that's from one of his wonderful, rather famous essays called Looking for Dragon Smoke. And I just, again, I believe that if we are to address these challenges, these incredible, intense challenges that we are facing with the natural world, with our ecological challenges of overshoot in so many areas, from climate to extinctions to ocean to soil degradation. All these areas, if we're going to do that, we're going to have to build our surprise muscle. We're going to have to build our ability to step back and be much more fluid, I think, with our beliefs and our assumptions, so that we can meet people where they are, so that we can begin to do things which we have never done before and change our minds with much more facility than we normally have done. Now let's get right into it. Robert Bly, for those of you who he may be a little newer to, was born in 1926 and died just last year, as I mentioned, in 2021. So he lived a rather long life, and he wrote amazing poetry. He translated so many incredible poets that, in addition to his own work. So he was just one amazing character. And like I say, I think he was just a master of pulling the rug out from under our normal way of seeing the world, which, is at the heart of poetry as far as I'm concerned. And it is so needed. That muscle to be able to shift and change for each of us is so important. So here's what he wrote. He wrote, "One day while studying a Yeats poem, I decided to write poetry the rest of my life." Now, that's a whole pattern interrupt just in and of itself. It's just a wild statement. "I recognize that a single short poem," said Bly, "has room for history, music, psychology, religious thought, mood, occult speculation, character, and events of one's own life. I still feel surprised that such various substances can find shelter and nourishment in a poem. A poem, in fact, may be a sort of nourishing liquid, such as one uses to keep an amoeba alive. If prepared right, a poem can keep an image or a thought or insights on history or the psyche alive for years, as well as our desires and airy impulses." That's what Robert Bly said about the beginning of his poetic career. Now, let's jump right into a poem I wanted to feature on today's podcast as we feature Robert Bly in this new format. It's called Bad People. Bad People. "A man told me once that all the bad people were needed. Maybe not all, but your fingernails you need. They are really claws, and we know claws. The sharks, what about them? They make other fish swim faster. The hard-faced men in black coats who chase you for hours in dreams, that's the only way to get you to the shore. Sometimes those hard women who abandon you get you to say, you. A lazy part of us is like a tumbleweed. It doesn't move on its own. It doesn't move on its own. Sometimes it takes a lot of depression to get tumbleweeds moving. Then they blow across 3 or 4 states. This man told me that things work together. This man told me that things work together. Bad handwriting sometimes leads to new ideas, and a careless God who refuses to let people eat from the tree of knowledge can lead to books and eventually to us. We write poems with lies in them, but they help a little. We write poems with lies in them, but they help a little." Now, there's so much to recommend this poem from my perspective. But one of the things that it does is it kind of pulls the rug. I've been using that metaphor or that cliche a lot, but it pulls the rug out from under the normal way we see things. We see, okay, well, that's a bad person and that's bad. Well, no, maybe from an ecological, from a system standpoint, there are ways in which things which we on the surface believe are absolutely terrible turn out to be something that was absolutely necessary. And no, I don't mean that we wish for terrible things. We don't wish for the ecological disasters that we're facing. We don't wish that the oil companies were lying to us. We don't wish that there was such a thing as greenwashing and that companies are doing everything they can to act as though they are moving toward a more ecological awareness, and yet they are not doing it. We think that that is only terrible. But maybe what the poem says might be true, that things do go together, that some things that look terrible on the surface are not so terrible below the surface. Again, Robert Bly was an absolute master in my mind in being able to shift that way. For example, here's a quote. I think that poetry is important when you are shipwrecked, when the ordinary structures that hold you up are gone. Doesn't that, it's like, who wants to be shipwrecked? And of course we don't. But what happens? What do you need when you're shipwrecked? What do you need when things fall apart? He says, I think poetry is important when you are shipwrecked, when the ordinary structures that hold you up are gone. He also says this, which I think from given our ecological theme, and by the way, when I say an ecological theme, that opens up the door hugely, because our challenges with overshoot, our challenges with climate, our challenges with the oceans and in so many areas where we are impacting the soils and the different ecosystems, all of those things, I think they speak to deeper questions. And so here is another quote where he starts out this, or where he says, the deeper question is how he starts this out. The deeper question is not whether ancient religious forms can reform. The deeper question is not whether ancient religious forms can reform, but whether new forms of nature-related spirituality might emerge. Now think about that. Think about the assumptions that we make for the last 40 or 50 years, particularly with the assumptions of a particular economic system known as neoliberalism, a kind of predatory capitalism which externalizes all these different costs, externalizing the challenges to ecosystems, externalizing the challenges to the ocean, to the climate, on and on and on. And we know that a new nature-related spirituality, as Bly describes, is going to be necessary. So, he also said one more quote, and then I want to do another poem by Bly. As I've gotten older, I find I am able to be nourished more by sorrow and to distinguish it from depression. That to me is a very, very interesting quote, because more and more we will have to be in the grieving sorrow for things that are passing, and yet be able to nourish a kind of energy, a kind of power that comes from that, and not to devolve into a depressive kind of almost a nihilism. Yeah. So I want to do a poem called The Resemblance Between Your Life and a Dog, another Robert Bly poem. And you begin to see how much he had this amazing, what I call coyote energy, which is this ability to use a combination of poignancy and humor all together to do the things we need doing. The Resemblance Between Your Life and a Dog, Robert Bly. I never intended to have this life. I never intended to have this life. Believe me, it just happened. You know how dogs turn up at a farm and they wag but can't explain? It's good if you can accept your life. You'll notice your face has become deranged, trying to adjust to it. Your face thought your life would look like your bedroom mirror when you were 10. That was a clear river touched by mountain wind. Even your parents can't believe how much you've changed. Sparrows in winter, if you've ever held one, all feathers, burst out of your hand with a fiery glee. You see them later in hedges. Teachers praise you, but you can't quite get back to the winter sparrow. Your life is a dog. He's been hungry for miles, doesn't particularly like you, but gives up and comes in. But you don't quite get back to the winter sparrow. Your life is a dog. He's been hungry for miles, doesn't particularly like you, but gives up and comes in. I just love the way that particular poem uses humor. And yet there are so many things in there, so many things like when we're disappointed, when we feel like, we were going to do some kind of heroic thing around the ecological challenges and that there was going to be some big, huge change, and we get disappointed and we get dejected and all of that. And yet, if we continue to put one foot in front of another and not lose the sense of not toxic hope. Toxic hope is the kind of hope that has no strategy underneath it. Toxic hope is just, it's just like hope rolling the dice. I'm not going to do anything, but I'm going to hope, and I'm going to believe that things are just going to work out. That's not the kind of hope I'm talking about. And that's not the kind of actions I'm talking about. But I'm also talking about being able to, it says you can't quite get back to the winter sparrow, that amazing vision that you had. There's nothing wrong with that vision. But the poem says, your life is a dog. He's been hungry for miles, doesn't particularly like you, but gives up and comes in. That doesn't mean that you are not doing your life's work, especially in this ecological realm. And in this, or around this whole subject, I was thinking about something that William Stafford, the poet William Stafford, once said. He said, time for all the heroes to go home, if they have any, and for us average folk to take over, or something like that. I'm paraphrasing, but I wrote a little something that is in this territory of when we feel like we've got to do something heroic and we have failed unless we do something, at that kind of global level. And I call this little piece, I Can Tell When I'm in Trouble. It goes like this. I can tell when I'm in trouble. I can tell when I'm in trouble. It's when I start feeling extra smart, separate, and superior. You know, believing in my own press clippings. Like I am right and you are wrong. As the great poet Rumi once said, somewhere beyond right and wrong, there is a garden. I will meet you there. Now, am I saying I won't act decisively without dithering? No. If you put your abstract neoliberal profits before my actual human life, I'll respond accordingly. If you pump dangerous chemicals and microplastic poisons into my water or into the air I breathe or those I love breathe, or increasingly into my bloodstream, I'm going to judge that behavior harshly. But hate the sin, love the sinner. And even if I can't exactly love, at least I'll hold all of it just a little lighter than before. See, I told you I was trying. And when I tell you, no, not here, not this, not now, for example, I'll do it with as centered a look of luster and gusto as I can muster, and without all that excessive and righteous baggage that is so easy to carry most everywhere I go. Now, back to a couple of quotes by Robert Bly, and then I want to do one of his translations, which is brilliant. Robert Bly once said, I knew this friendship with myself couldn't last forever. I just think that's great. I just love it. Again, another pattern interrupt, another way to go, wait a minute. Let's not take ourselves too seriously. Let's take our work seriously, but not ourselves. He also once said, it is not our job to remain whole. It is not our job to remain whole. We came to lose our leaves like the trees and be born again, drawing up from the great roots. There's Robert Bly. So one of the reasons I fell in love with Bly's poetry so long ago is the amazing skillfulness of his translations. And he did, some of the most amazing non-English speaking poets that you can imagine, including Rilke, the great German poet. And here is a translation by Robert Bly that of a poem called Solid Rock by Rilke that I think is so amazing. It goes like this. It is possible that I am pushing through solid rock. It is possible that I am pushing through solid rock in flint-like layers as the ore lies alone. I am such a long way in, and I can see no way through and no space. Everything is close to my face, and everything close to my face is stone. I don't have much knowledge yet in grief, so this darkness makes me feel small. You be the master, make yourself fierce, break in. Then your great transforming will happen to me, and my great grief cry will happen to you. You be the master, make yourself fierce, break in, then your great transforming will happen to me, and my great grief cry will happen to you. There's Robert Bly, doing a wonderful translation of a Rilke poem, as I've already said, and it is it's amazing. And again, on to this theme of being awake and constantly questioning our own assumptions and our own way of seeing the world. And I think that this is going to be the only way that we are going to stay anywhere close to being effective in this work that we must do. Healing the natural world. I think it is our only option, is to stay open and creative and very aware. Bly once wrote, if a man cautious hides his limp, somebody has to limp it. If a man cautious hides his limp, somebody has to limp it. Things do it. The surroundings limp. House walls get scars. The car breaks down. Matter, in drudgery, takes it up. You know, you can say with all the things which have been happening, with the pandemic, with the war in Ukraine, with the parade of news which is happening, and again, not just about climate. Climate is only one symptom of our larger challenge of overshoot on this, our planet Earth. And as all those things come at us, I think that we do not realize how traumatizing and traumatic those things can be. And if we try to pretend or ignore, then what happens is the house walls get scars, the cars break down, matter in drudgery takes it up. In other words, it is going to show up. It is not going to remain in the background only. Now, as we head toward the barn, as they used to say, and are about to close this particular episode, I wanted to say there's another quote by Bly which I wanted to bring forward. He said, "My feeling is that poetry is also a healing process, and then when a person tries to write poetry with depth or beauty, he will find himself guided along paths which will heal him, and this is more important, actually, than any of the poetry he writes or she writes." So, again, I think that Bly has this amazing way of, again, just these pattern interrupts. And we do, I think, have to become more facile. He also said, I just see one more quote, "One could say the higher the spirit goes, the more deeply the soul sinks down into the waters of melancholy and tragedy. Drowning in that water is as sweet as rising." Drowning in that water is as sweet as rising. And that brings me full circle, mentioning the soul, that brings me full circle to this new context which we are creating for this podcast, the new name, the new focus, the new name, Why Our Souls Don't Dither. Now, of course, what I mean by that is that the soul really understands its own deepest mission. In fact, I love the saying that is, the soul would rather fail at its own work. Our soul would rather fail at its own work than succeed in someone else's. So I think that's a good and appropriate place for us to wrap this particular edition. And I just want to say again, thank you for your listening ear. Thank you for listening to previous editions of this podcast. I would hope that the new format and my focusing on individual poets, of course, there's going to be continued wonderful poetry. I hope that appeals and that you'll continue to join us and me for each of these podcasts in the future. And I would also say that there's some other bonus material that's now available. I'm doing something called Poetry Mondays, which is just a little short 2, 3, 4 minute, 5 minute maybe single poem. And that's coming out on Mondays. And I've just started something called Saturday Songs. And I'll be putting that up as well, and also up on YouTube. So anyway, lots of stuff going on. And I just so appreciate your listening ear, as I've already said. Thank you so much. And please take good care of yourself.